Dear Tony Greenstein, I bid you welcome to the Nexus and thank you for being here. I hope it didn't cause too much inconvenience since you had to come in a bit past the time.
I know, I'm sorry about that, but I have been extremely busy blogging and God knows what. Yeah.
I understand. It's an eternal struggle, isn't it?
Yes, at the moment in particular it is, yes. Yes, with genocide happening in Palestine. I mean, things like that, it's not been easy, but fire away.
Of course. So I came out to you because I had a podcast with Angelo Giuliano. I don't know if you know him. He's also a political analyst in the sphere.
Who's
And he
that?
has
Sorry, I didn't catch that.
Angelo Giuliano.
No, I don't think I do.
He sent me a link of a podcast, and that's how I stumbled onto you. And as far as I know, you have been an activist for quite a while.
Right,
And
no, sure. I don't know every activist.
now, so you're also an author, and you're a founding member of the Palestine Solidarity Campaign and Jews for Boycotting Israeli Goods. Is that about
I
right?
am for my sins, yes.
For my sins. What would you consider yourself more of an author or more of an activist and blogger? What do you think is your main contribution?
I consider myself all three. My activism is part of my writing. I don't see that you can write without taking part in the struggle, because otherwise it simply becomes divorced from that struggle. So I'm very much of the belief that activism and writing and blogging go hand in hand.
Mm-hmm. Well, I consider you a scholar also, given the depth of knowledge I found in your podcast, at least. I have yet to read your book. As far as I know, the book just came out, right? It's Zionism during the Holocaust.
That's right. Yes, it came out at the end of 2022. But I mean, demand has been fairly constant for it ever since. And of course, the present hostilities and the attacks, which it was subtitled The Weaponization of Memory, and that's exactly what we're seeing, where Israel claims to inherit the memory of the Holocaust victims who died, when it would be more accurate to say it inherits the memory of those who killed them.
So the way I was thinking of structuring this is I wanted to ask you two or three questions about yourself, more, not quite personal, but on a more personal note, and then delve into the I guess, current situation, the history of how we came to where we are today. So if you don't mind, let me ask you, do you consider yourself a contrarian? Do you like debating? Do you like proving others wrong and being right?
I don't think of myself as a contrarian, but I see that we exist in a society where there are certain narratives which are false, not least about the society itself, peacemaking and all that. So I don't see the need to prove people wrong for the sake of so doing. It depends what it is they stand for. And then, of course, I wish to prove them wrong. I don't think there's any merit in it for its own for its own sake, because otherwise you go down the road of Christopher Hitchens, who was also a contrarian but ended up supporting the American war effort in Iraq, for example. So I don't think it's a futile task just to pick holes in someone else for the sake of so doing.
Then I have another one, which is also something that interests me personally, because I just started doing this whole writing articles and podcasting. I'm here in Switzerland. I'm trying to set up base, because most of the public intellectuals that I've seen, most of the analysts, are either scattered around the globe or they're in the US. So I'm trying to create a movement here in Europe, right? Because Europe has been just the puppy dog of the US as far as I can see. And so the question from me to you is, what drove you to get politically, not just politically, it's also politically and scholarly involved also in your activism?
I suppose it was being born in a Jewish Zionist family and becoming an anti-Zionist. It meant that if I had any credibility or integrity, then I had to speak out against the Zionism, which was committing its crimes in my name. So it was as simple as that, really. And the fact that I was a socialist, so I saw capitalist society as being particularly iniquitous and exploitive. And of course, imperialism, which is its handmaiden.
Mm-hmm.
But my own personal motives, in the sense, are neither here nor there. It's the fact that thousands upon thousands of people have taken to the streets, millions, in fact, against the horrors that we're seeing in the society we live in. I mean, that's the important thing, not me personally.
Yeah, no, I agree. So I asked Angelo Giuliano the same question, and he was the answer he gave very much resonated with me, which is that you have this inner sense of morals, and you want to have integrity. That is, you want to stand up for your values, right? And at some point, the pain of just seeing not just the news, but seeing what's happening around you and feeling and seeing those people just gets high enough for you to just start doing things, right? Yeah. So I would then segue into the current happenings of the world. And maybe before we get into the current events, can you give you may have done this a lot, and I'm sorry for asking you this, but can you sketch out what you write in your book on how Zionism has been instrumentalized, and how this victimhood role has been instrumentalized and also marketed to
Well, Zionism was a Christian idea. It wasn't a Jewish idea. It arose, I mean, really in the Enlightenment, in the age of Cromwell and beyond. The idea that a Jewish return to Palestine was necessary in order that Christians could meet their Messiah, who would then come to the earth in the battles of Armageddon. And it became a political project in the 19th century, where various imperialists saw the need strategically for a Jewish or a settler colonial state adjacent to the Suez Canal. And of course, if you tie the Bible into it, you give it a rationale which isn't wholly strategic, as it were. So, I mean, my task in my book was simply to explain the origins of Zionism, some of its components, like so-called socialist Zionism, and to show how Zionism was considered by Jews from its start as a form of Jewish anti-Semitism. And then, I mean, that's the first part of the book. It's the shortest part. And then the main bulk of it is about the Zionist record during the Holocaust, because the Holocaust was a pivotal event in helping to create the Israeli state. It gave it momentum. It gave it a critical mass of settlers. It gave it, after the war, the ideal pretext for the establishment of a Jewish state, although Zionism itself had saved no one, quite the contrary. So, I mean, all of these things, I mean, I show how Zionism during the war was not interested in either the Holocaust or rescuing Jewish refugees. On the contrary, they opposed rescue to any place other than Palestine, because according to their logic, if you could save Jews by going anywhere else, then what was the point of having a Jewish state? And I go into the ideology of Zionism, which looked on the Jewish diaspora with the same contempt as the anti-Semites themselves. And if you didn't know, many of the things that the Zionists said about the Jewish diaspora could have come from the anti-Semites. So there was that symmetry between Zionism and anti-Semitism, which has always been there. But the Holocaust was very important because the majority of Jews before the war were not Zionists. They were anti-Zionists, if anything. The war changed that. The Holocaust seemed to vindicate the Zionist message that Jews would not be safe outside the state of their own. And that was a very powerful ideological, if you like, motive in establishing the state. And so there were relatively few opponents of it. In 1948, the Soviet Union changed sides and so on and so forth. So my book is really an attempt to look at the history of that era, not through the kind of fables and storybooks of Zionism, with the ship Exodus arriving on the banks of Palestine and so on, and all the heroes that accompanied, but to look at actually what Zionism did and what Zionism was, which it was a reflection of European anti-Semitism. So, I mean, that in a nutshell is what the book is, and then I bring it up to date, and I show in the last section how Zionism today, via the State of Israel, works with some of the most reprehensible regimes in the world, including anti-Semitic regimes. That, once again, Zionism has no problem with anti-Semitism, but it labels all its opponents as anti-Semitic, including, of course, Jewish ones. So I suppose that would be a short summary.
Thank you. If I were to push back on that, because I have a little anecdote that I want to tell after we've established the situation today, which is that, for example, a pushback could be, well, Zionism is only the statement that the Jewish people should have a state of their own. And generally speaking, that statement is considered true by most people. Does it go beyond that, or would you say that's a sufficient definition for Zionism?
Well, the Zionist movement, Zionism, was a movement for the establishment of a Jewish state. But the question A is, what is a Jewish state? And B, why should they have that right? The whole basis of Zionism is that the Jews form a separate nation race. If you didn't, then there would certainly mean no reason for a state. The Christians don't form a nation, so there's no right to a Christian state, and there's no right to a Muslim state. And in practice, Israel is not simply a Jewish state culturally. I mean, Britain is a Christian state nominally, but it's ethnically a Jewish state, which means if you're not Jewish, you're automatically second or third class citizen. You don't really belong. So that in Israel, if you're not Jewish, you suffer severe discrimination in terms of land, jobs, etc., because you're not Jewish. In Britain, by contrast, which is to say nominally a Christian state, there is no law that discriminates against Jews in terms of their rights as a citizen, apart from maybe the fact that we can't become head of state, that is the king or queen. I mean, which is not a great loss to most people.
Yeah, but generally in society, this is a very powerful propagandistic message of just stating that the Jewish people should have a state of their own, right? And then they usually invoke the Holocaust as a justification for that.
Well,
And
yes,
so,
it is. I mean, it's a powerful message, but people don't look beneath it, which is, are Jews a separate nation by themselves? If it is, it means they're aliens in the lands where they live.
But then that leads me to the to reformulating the nutshell summary of your book, which is basically that Zionism is a political movement with a strategic goal wrapped in this powerful ideological message of Zionism. Because you also mentioned the Suez Canal, right? This is a very strategic emplacement for the state of Israel, right? So we had the attacks on October 7th. So let me bring it up to today, because I think this is also very relevant, and this is where we can maybe pick up most people. We had the attacks on October 7th, which triggered a whole avalanche of news, interviews, publications, and again, a whole avalanche of narratives, as it usually goes in the West. How would you summarize, if like in your own words, what happened on October 7th and why? And would you just say that the events actually started on October 7th that we're seeing today?
Well, October the 7th was, if you like, the culmination of the occupation and the siege of Gaza. And it was an uprising led, I guess, by Hamas, a breakout from what was widely considered and acknowledged to be an open air prison, if not a concentration camp. So it was a justified resistance operation. That doesn't therefore mean one necessarily supports all the tactics, such as shooting civilians and so on and so forth. But I mean, that is what it is. Of course, the Zionists have changed the narrative entirely. This was the second. This was the largest massacre of Jews since the Second World War, which is not true. In Argentina, 3,000 Jews died because they were Jews under a fascist junta between 1976 and 83. In Israel, the Jewish casualties, or the Israeli casualties, because at least 100 of them were non-Jewish, were nothing to do with their religion and everything to do with their role as occupiers and oppressors. So, I mean, that is a crucial difference. And to align the two is to really let the Nazis off the hook, apart from anything else. Jews in the Holocaust were killed because they were Jews. Israelis who died in October the 7th did not die because they were Jews, because of who they were, because of what they were doing.
Mm-hmm. I've heard the argument made, I believe it was among others from Norman Finkelstein, whom I believe you have also met and debated. And the argument is that not realizing that these people doing an uprising in the concentration camp, not realizing that this is an uprising from an oppressed people, that is what actually sullies the memories of those people that actually suffered in the Holocaust. Because if we celebrate the uprising in Warsaw, if we celebrate slave uprisings in the past, then we should also celebrate this uprising. And if we say this was a terrorist attack, then so should we do about the Warsaw uprising, for example, among others. What do you make of that line of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Norman Finkelstein on that. This was the uprising of the Gaza ghetto. And the Israeli complaints afterwards are hypocritical cant, given the number of attacks and invasions of Gaza, the bombings and so on, which have caused thousands of casualties before October the 7th. But for Israel, Palestinian deaths are meaningless. They don't count. The only deaths that count are those of the settlers themselves. So, yes, I mean, if you condemn the uprising of Palestinians, then you condemn the uprising of the ghettos as well in under Nazi Germany.
Mm.
Yeah, I have no problem with that.
Now, most people would probably push against the statement that Gaza is an open-air concentration camp, because in everyday language, concentration camp is usually equated to extermination camp, which is not quite true. A concentration camp can exist.
Yeah, there were death camps and there were concentration camps.
Exactly.
There's a very clear difference between them.
So what also most people are woefully ignorant of is that that Gaza is one of the most densely populated areas in the world, denser even than Tokyo. Mm. That has sort of started to make the headlines, but what most people ignore is the level of uninhabitability that Israel has inflicted upon these people. Half of the population are kids. Over 70% of the population of Gaza are refugees or descendants of refugees. I believe half of the population of Gaza is considered by international humanitarian organizations as at the risk of severe food insecurity. I believe it was 98% of the water there cannot be drank, is unfit for consumption. There is 50% unemployment, 60% unemployment for the youth, which is the highest in the world. 1/5 of the population has gone through the Israeli prison system, and it goes on and on and on and on. And so what also most people ignore is that Gaza is surrounded by a 5 to 7 meter tall fence with 50 caliber remote controlled turrets on top, which we've seen the Hamas people drop mortar shells from their drones. And I'm also curious, how would you, I've seen pundits such as Ben Shapiro say that the Hamas fighters are using the pipes, and it serves them right that they have no water because they use the pipes to build the rockets. And I mean, I have my own counter to that, and I find it so deeply disingenuous. But I'm curious, what would you say if you had Ben Shapiro make that argument in front of you?
I'm not sure what his argument is, that they should be deprived of water because they make bombs. I mean, this is a Nazi mentality. What more can I say? You deprive a whole population of water in order to prevent them resisting your occupation. I mean, it's so obviously wrong. Would you say the same about Ukraine or any other country that was under occupation? I mean, it's illogical. It's the argument of a Jewish Nazi.
So you're saying it basically even fails the basic moral premise of decency.
Well, it's the logic of someone who supports genocide.
There's also the argument being made often that Hamas used very brutal tactics. They stopped cars, they shot people, and so on. And people generally ask, why did they not try peaceful means?
Well, peaceful means don't work against Israel because Israel doesn't recognize pacifism. And the pacifists like Issa Amro in Hebron, who's been repeatedly attacked, beaten up, framed, and so on. Israel treats pacifism with contempt. So clearly, non-violent resistance will have no effect whatsoever on it. As for stopping cars with and shooting the occupants, yes, I know some did happen. That's a great pity, but obviously in wars things like that happen. But the vast majority of the cars that were bombed out on October the 7th were killed by the Apache helicopters, not by Hamas, who bombed any and everything that was moving, it seemed. They had no orders apart from taking everything out under the Hannibal Directive. So I don't buy that argument either. But in any case, even if individual tactics of Hamas and the fighters cannot be supported, remember there were 3 waves of attack: Hamas, other resistance groups, and then just the general population. Even if you accept that, it doesn't negate the right to resist or the support for the resistance operation.
I was actually also wanting to mention the example of the last big example of peaceful means, which was the Great March of Return in 2018. It was non-violent, right?
Yes.
What does Israel do? This is a report, according to reports from the UN, Israel targeted medical personnel, journalists, disabled people. Snipers targeted kneecaps and below of the people marching. So after all these many attempts, of which this is just one of the latest ones, of the biggest ones, of peaceful protests, how do people still expect Gazans to do that? But I wanted to elaborate more on that which you just said about the events of October 7th themselves, where you mentioned the Apache helicopters. This is something most people are unaware of. Most people say on October 7th, Hamas just broke out and killed 1,200 civilians. That's roundabout the mainstream narrative, right? Or the gated conventional wisdom, if you want to put it a bit more euphemistically. And so, as far as I know, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe you have better intel on this. As far as I know, there were 1,200 people that died on that day, indeed, of which about 400 were combatants, military people guarding the outposts that we saw clips of around Gaza, where you had all these tanks and those engineering vehicles that Hamas fighters captured. Many of them were also in the kibbutzim, such as the famous one, Kibbutz Be'eri, and the other one whose name escapes me now. And these
Nahal Oz was, I think, the main one.
Which one?
Nahal Oz, I think.
Oh, I don't think I can pronounce that. In any case, these kibbutzim are part of the paramilitary safety zone around the Gaza Strip, right? Those people in there, they're either contract soldiers, or they're in other ways engaged in the security services around Gaza.
I don't think that's true, actually, but no matter.
Okay.
There were families living there who had nothing to do with the military, other than the adults might serve in the reserve. But there were children. I mean, there were families, but the kibbutzim today are not the kibbutzim of 1920. They're not stockade and watchtower settlements. They are just Israeli communities, albeit all Jewish members. Arabs aren't members of kibbutzim.
All right. Well, as far as I had read, they are actually occupied by active soldiers or security personnel, which also have rifles in the houses. Okay, so I disagree on that one. That's good. I learned something every day. And finally, so 1/3 of these people were soldiers, as far as I know, and we don't know the exact number currently, but it seems like a majority of the civilians that died on October 7th, including those cars that you mentioned, because we have actually the morgues of the cars where the cars have been collected, and we can see at least 1/3 of the cars are fully burnt out. And no amount of small firearms fire as the Hamas had, and not even RPGs could cause that kind of damage. It's actually Hellfire missile that cause that kind of damage. And firstly, do you agree? Do you agree with that assessment, more or less, or do you have something to add or to change?
I mean, I agree that up to that about 1/3 of the casualties or those who died were military, the Gaza division. I would say up to half of those who were killed, the remainder were probably killed by Israel. We won't know, we don't know the numbers, but clearly Israel killed a lot of its own people. I mean, there were 121 living in Kibbutz Be'eri, for example, and they were killed in the Israeli tank shells, which demolished the houses, and the crossfire, because Israel preferred to open fire rather than negotiate. So yes, I mean, undoubtedly, Israel killed a large number of civilians. We won't know, and we don't know, but clearly, the story is a different one from the one that is the mainstream narrative.
You don't think there will be an investigation one day and will uncover the actual numbers?
There might be an Israeli investigation. I don't think they're very eager to carry out an exact investigation. I think the Israeli investigation will be into the intelligence failure that led to October the 7th, not who killed who when. And it will be very difficult now to determine many of the casualties. They will simply remain an unknown.
I see. Maybe we should sketch out for our listeners who might not have heard of this. What can you say about the Hannibal Directive, which you mentioned earlier?
Well, the Hannibal Directive, which operated in Lebanon, was directed at preventing the situation whereby Israel had to release thousands of Palestinian prisoners, even for one soldier who'd been captured. The last such exchange was at Gilad Shalit some years ago. And so the directive basically says that it's better to kill the Israeli who's been taken captive than to allow them to be held as a captive and then later exchanged. Israel certainly put that into operation in Operation Protective Edge in 2014. But now it appears that it was extended to civilians, and from midday onwards, basically helicopter pilots were given the order to shoot at whatever moved, regardless of who was in the car or cars. So I don't think there's any doubt. Yediot Ahronot revealed that from midday on October the 7th, the Hannibal Directive was put into practice, and the results are for all to see.
Mm-hmm. As far as I know, there are two main directives of the Israeli Defense Forces that are ruling over this conflict. It's the aforementioned Hannibal Directive, which is named after this, what was it, Carthaginian, I believe, General Hannibal, who preferred, I think, poisoning himself rather than being taken captive. I'm a bit rusty on the exact details, but I think that was it. And the second directive that the Israeli forces operate under, I think it's called Da'iya or Bai. It was Da'iya.
Yeah.
I believe that's named after the Lebanese. It's not a headquarters. It's the
suburb of Beirut.
Suburb of Beirut, where the Hezbollah was stationed. I believe it was in 2006, if I'm not mistaken.
It might well be. It might well be.
Well, in any case, the Israeli forces went in there and razed the entire suburb. And
Mm.
so the Daya directive is basically a directive of collective punishment in the name of reaching their military target.
Mm.
Would you agree with that? Those are the two main directives that we see, observe
Well,
from
there's
2017.
also, if Richard Silverstein is correct, there's a third directive, the Amalekite directive, which is to wipe out the population of Gaza if they don't exit.
Oh, okay. I had not heard of that one. Interesting. So I have been more focused on Ukraine personally. It's just something that captivates my interest, and I'm also from Bulgaria, so I also know
Mm.
the culture, the Orthodox culture, more or less. I guess I'm a Slav also. And so I have been researching this, and the way I see this is that there is this changing world order that seems to be hinging on this conflict of Ukraine, where the unipolar hegemonic moment of the US seems to be fading, and we seem to be transitioning into a move of multipolarity with China, Russia, India, Brazil, and other nations on the rise, and the BRICS states, replacing the rules-based order with an actual UN-based international law order. And so after seeing all the complexities, all the history leading up to the conflict in Ukraine and how all the actors interacted and all that intertwined, complex set of gears that happens in Ukraine, when I look over to Gaza and Israel, even though I have been reading up on this for years now, and I guess I'm not as well informed on that one as I am on Ukraine, but to me, at least intellectually, it seems much less fascinating. And I mean just intellectually, I don't want to say anything wrong here, because it seems to me it's just a simple case of a brutal genocide.
What,
Would you
in
disagree with
Ukraine?
that? No, in Gaza.
No, it's more than just a brutal genocide, although it is that too. The main aim of Israel today, as has been made clear by members of the government from Netanyahu down, is basically to achieve the ethnic cleansing of Gaza. Whether they do achieve that is arguable, but certainly, in my view, the United States is facilitating that ethnic cleansing, and that's partly what this new so-called peer and port is about. But ethnic cleansing and genocide always go together. If you can't ethnically cleanse a population, then you murder them. I mean, that was the case with the Nazis. They first wanted the Jews out of Germany, and it was only when they couldn't achieve that and also uh, the expulsion of Jews from the countries they conquered that they turned to genocide. And likewise in Gaza, the Israelis are using, if you like, the genocide as a means of encouraging Palestinians to exit.
Mm-hmm. It seemed to me like this operation that they're leading now into Gaza seemed to have had as a goal initially to push the Palestinians out into Egypt. Is that what it seemed to you as well initially?
I think initially it was, but Egypt pushed back because it didn't want what would have been an extremely destabilizing population in an area which was already unstable.
Mm-hmm.
So Egypt made it clear that that wasn't on. And then other solutions are being looked at, such as emigration by sea.
Mm-hmm. I want to address one more topic on this, which is the atrocity propaganda. And the atrocity propaganda is, it's actually nothing new, and yet people keep falling for it again and again and again. We had the accusations of rape in Libya in 2011 when NATO went in and bombed Libya.
Mm.
And we had the UN spokesperson, I believe her name is Pramila Patten, who was involved in fabricating those stories of Viagra-fueled rape squads roaming in Libya, which was meant to polarize and get public opinion on board with that intervention. We had the same story in Ukraine with Ludmila Denisova, which was the ombudswoman for human rights of Ukraine, who got fired because she invented
All right.
those claims. And now we have all the same stories recycled for Hamas based on testimonies every time of people getting raped, of 40 babies having been beheaded, of the one baby that was torn out of the womb of a woman, etc., etc. What do you make of these
Well,
allegations?
I'm writing a blog at the moment on it, but yes, I agree. I'm not aware of what happened in Ukraine or Libya, for that matter. But the the narrative of rape it is not a new one. The idea that the people you colonize are sexually predatory and threatening is not a new one. I mean, you had the Black Peril in Southern Africa about black men. You had a similar narrative in the Deep South in the United States. Uh, and of course, in Nazi Germany, Jews were seen as sexually predatory, or Jewish men were. So, I mean, this is nothing new. So, when it's used against Hamas in the way it has been, then yes, it fits into a long line of colonial practice. I'm not saying that on October the 7th there were no rapes, because I think it's quite probable there were, uh, not least amongst those who came in the third wave. But I don't believe for a minute there's any evidence that Hamas, which is a disciplined organization and which has its own religious and social taboos against it, indulged in that. And the fact that all the captives who've come back, none of them have alleged, to the best of my knowledge, that they were attacked sexually. Indeed, there were a number who testified to the very excellent treatment they had in the circumstances. So, yes, I mean, this is a narrative always used, rape, to put fear amongst the children, that you know, you mustn't question women who make allegations of rape, even though they may have specific motives for making those allegations. We know that. I mean, we know that over Julian Assange, for instance, where the same narrative occurred. So this is nothing new. And there are, of course, a section of feminists who go along with that because they're pro-imperialists.
Yeah, well, while on that note of imperialism, this is a very, I find it rather fascinating how in so many ways Western policies are dictated by this ideology of supremacism. Like in the case of Israel, it's the chosen people, right? But it's not just Israel, it's the whole of Europe. We're meant to believe that these people, just because they have a different religion and maybe somewhat different ethnicity, their ethnicity, by the way, being actual Semites, the Palestinians.
Well, I disagree. I don't think there is such an ethnicity. Semitic
Oh.
refers to languages, it doesn't refer to people.
Mm.
And that's why Wilhelm Marr got it wrong in 1879 in his pamphlet, when he coined or popularized the term anti Semitism. It was based on the myth that the Jews of Europe actually came from the Middle East, which they didn't.
Okay,
So
interesting.
The
Then I retract the Semitic ethnic statement in that case.
Yeah, I don't think it's helpful in the slightest.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I think you're right. But my main statement is that in the West, we're so thoroughly driven by supremacism. I wrote a whole article about the neocon ideology that has been driving US foreign policy since the 1960s. And I took it apart through a scientific lens, going over psychology, personality type research, also anthropology, going through some very fascinating literature there, including Robert Trexler's book. I don't know if you've ever encountered it. It's like a huge tome. In any case, we're just meant to believe that these people are such barbaric others, savages, that we can just believe that they went in there in the midst of an intense gunfight where one of the strongest militaries in the world, right? The IDF is mobilizing against it, that these people have time to go around and rape. And one of the stories was that they mutilated a woman, cut off her breast, and then played around with it. I mean, it's just absurd on so many levels. And furthermore, we actually have, I don't know if you've seen it, the Gray Zone did an excellent investigation into these claims. And according to them, we actually have the list of all the names of the people that died on October 7th. And there has been just one person under the age of 2, about those baby
I think there are 2 babies, in fact.
There were 2? As far as I remember, there was one, and it was shot down by gunfire. So the whole story about
there was
babies,
one who was caught by a stray bullet. The other child, I can't remember. There were 2 babies in the final total. It's on the iFrance 24 site. There's a definitive total of 1,139 who died total.
Oh, the point is that we never have accountability in the West, do we? We just put out these stories. We launch terrible wars. In this case, it isn't even a war, it's just a slaughter. I mean, it's not a war. A war would be if Hamas had tanks, had anti-air cannons, had an actual military. This is just about, what is it, 30,000 fighters, most of whom are orphans after operations Sweeping Edge, Cast Iron, and all the other incursions.
Yeah.
So let me bring you to that little anecdote that I mentioned earlier. In February, I spent most of February in Thailand, and in Thailand, on that island, there were these, I guess, parties and hippie-like gatherings. And what I seemed to notice there, and it's not just Thailand, it seems to be anywhere there's like a Goa festival or something like that. There's a gathering of these hippie type of people, and there is a high density of Israelis in there. And so I had a dinner that I had just got, and I sat down next to this this girl, I guess, this young woman. I'd say mid 20s roughly, maybe end 20s, and then we started talking, and then obviously we went on to the topic of what will happen on October 7th, because she turned out to be Israeli. But before then, I asked her, how come there's so many Israelis among the hippie communities? And then she gave an answer that to them, this is like therapy, like Goa or musical hippie therapy from the hardships they endure in the military. And I found that fascinating because I don't know, it rings true to me. But then again, we started talking, and when we talked about October 7th, she doubted anything, literally anything that could even slightly risk to tarnish the reputation of Israel. She doubted the numbers of deaths occurred in Gaza. She doubted the numbers of children. She was fully committed to believing all the atrocities committed by Hamas on October 7th. And she was very skeptical about the deaths in the West Bank, because I mentioned in 2022, I think it was 300 people died in the West Bank. In 2021, it was some 150 people. In 2019, it was 150 people, and it goes on and on and on. And there is no Hamas in the West Bank. There's just settlers there stealing the houses.
Well, there is Hamas, but they're relatively, I suppose, isolated. But yeah, there is some supporters of Hamas, and Hamas probably has the support of more people than any other political faction in the West Bank.
Well, let me bring it to my question to you. How do you talk to such a person?
Well, the simple answer is that you probably can't, because you can't on an individual basis undo years of programming. And she's been born into that society, and she sees everything from the perspective of that society. It'd be like, how do you talk a member of the Hitler Youth out of their beliefs as well? I wouldn't try. Yes, she'll believe it, because the very Israeli society is based and built upon the dispossession of the Palestinians, whom they classify as anti-Semitic for opposing them rather than for the real reasons. So such a person is beyond redemption. But the main point, of course, racism, racial supremacy was always, if you like, the ideological guarantor or narrative that the imperialist nations, the Western nations, used in order to justify conquering other people's territories. I mean, that is a fact, and it manifests itself in different formations. Manifest Destiny in the United States, the chosen people for Zionism. For the British, it was the white man's burden. But whatever, I mean, it operates in much the same way, because every ruling group needs some kind of moral legitimation, and it does that, and Israel also does it. So the woman you spoke to, she's just a product of the society that she's born into.
So you're being pessimistic on this note?
I don't think it's possible. I mean, and even if it were possible, you're talking about a one-to-one basis. The vast majority of Israelis adopt that narrative. It's only a minority who are able to see through it.
Well, I'd like to think there is a way of talking to this kind of people. I don't know. Are you hearing this engine that activated behind me?
Well, I'm a Marxist. I believe that material facts determine ideology in the end, not the other way around. Ideology doesn't change society. It's society that produces ideology and ideas. Uh, it may not be a one-to-one correlation, but that is usually what happened. You have slavery, so you have a justification of slavery.
Mm,
You have the conquering of the American West or what have you, and then the ideology of Indians as savages and who attack us for no reason, etc., emerges as a consequence. So
yeah.
uh, I think you have to look at it in that way. So unless you change material circumstances, you won't change the ideas of most people. That was true in South Africa. I mean, the whites didn't abandon apartheid through any love of black people because they were forced to. It
Mm,
doesn't mean their ideas have changed. I mean, to this day, the majority of whites in South Africa are racist.
yeah. No, I agree. I consider, so I'm a physicist. I consider myself somewhat of a scientist, at least after this education. And I wouldn't call myself Marxist, but I do agree on the very premise that, yeah, the material circumstances, no matter which population you put, as long as you put certain circumstances there, like, I don't know, the access to resources, the access to a better future, and so on and so forth, you will have certain outcomes that are perhaps not predictable with current models, but definitely determined to happen. And so let me, I think we will be going soon on to 1 hour, and you said you only had 1 hour. So let me steer it towards an end. How do you see this end? And what can we, and I mean, with we, let's say Swiss or Central European, Western European people do, and why should we care?
Well, the liberation of the Palestinians is bound up with our own liberation because it operates on the basis of imperialism, and imperialism destroys our own social circumstances in order to fund its war efforts. So in Britain, we have a rundown National Health Service, which is creaking at the joints as it's defunded and privatised. At the same time as you have an expansion in the military budget. So they do go hand in hand. Uh, as to what the eventual outcome of all these things will be, I simply don't know. Who can predict what will happen in Gaza? But we know things have changed. We don't know what's going to happen in the Middle East because the precondition for the overthrow of Zionism is the overthrow of the Arab rulers whose existence is also guaranteed by imperialism. So there are lots of questions, but you say, what can we do? Is build as wide and as strong solidarity movements as possible, both in support of the Palestinians and also against our own military-industrial complex.
Mm-hmm. I found that, can I just ask you to elaborate on the last statement? You said that a precondition for the removal of the Zionist movement is the removal, well, for the liberation of the Palestinians, is the removal of the Arab leaders? How
Well,
so?
they're complicit. I mean, they're partners with the United States. You see them sitting down with the United States and Anthony Blinken, and reports, if they're correct, that Doha is thinking of expelling Hamas because it doesn't accord with what they want it to do. You see that the Arab regimes partner the United States and therefore Israel. I mean, you've had this whole normalization process repeatedly. I mean, the Arab regimes are compliant and comprador regimes which operate on behalf of imperialism, and Israel, to a large extent, is their guarantor. So that they go hand in hand. The destruction of Zionism means removal of the imperialist presence in the Middle East, and that must include the Arab states too. I mean, there's also a simple question of demographics. Unlike in South Africa, Israeli Jews constitute approximately half the population of Palestine. And so the Palestinians are not strong enough and capable enough of removing Zionism. Unlike in South Africa, they're not exploited primarily. They're employed at the margins, and therefore it's possible, as it has been the case now, to remove them from most jobs in Israel. So it is to the Arab masses that the solution will eventually be found, I believe. But they're interconnected. I mean, they're related, obviously.
Well, since since that wasn't quite the positive note I was hoping for, let me provide it. Since as I said, I'm more into the Ukraine transitioning into a multipolar world phenomenon that we're currently observing. I believe that this multipolar world with BRICS and international law starting to be upheld, maybe I'm being naive and optimistic, but I do believe that we're headed in that direction. I do believe that this will provide the Arab nation a means to detach from the US hegemony. And that way we might actually see the condition you just mentioned fulfilled. And we might actually also see the diminishing of the power of the US and therefore of Israel as a local, well, unsinkable aircraft carriers to cite some former military people. And so I believe that this generation of Palestinians has seen the horrors which we can't even imagine. But I do believe that perhaps already the following, we'll start to see light as the world transitions away from US hegemony.
Well, I'm more in favor of cracking US and weakening US hegemony, but I am not as optimistic as you that simply because we're moving from a stage of one superpower to maybe a multiplicity, China in particular, that we will peace and love will break out. India is an extremely repressive state, which is also becoming an ethno-nationalist state, a Hindu supremacist state, Hindutva. Putin is certainly no progressive figure. China is certainly not a socialist or democratic society. So I see in the end that the end of class exploitation nationally and internationally. In other words, the end of capitalism is the key thing to strive for, not simply a reduction in the role of the US as the major imperialist power. So it's far more fundamental than that.
No, I'd say, unless I misunderstand your terms, I agree with you on that one. But I do see, to bring it back to what you said before about the Arab leaders being removed as a precondition, I do see US hegemony being removed as a precondition to moving away.
Saudi Arabia doesn't want to remove the United States entirely because it depends on it for support. And the same with other Arab regimes.
Yes, but I do believe that's a parochial limitation. I do believe it's a limitation of the current system. And I do see that the removal of the US as a hegemon will open the doors towards a new economic system, as you allude to. Yeah.
Well, we shall see as time passes who is right. Anyway, I'm afraid I do have to go now. I have a mass of things, but thank you for an interesting talk, and I'm sure we'll exchange views some other day.
I'd be glad. Thank you, Tony Greenstein. I will link to whatever links you send me below this video.
Okay, yeah, thank you.